What would happen if Earth's land was entirely covered by forests? Would the air be fresher and life more prosperous? Wrong. The last time Earth was covered by forests, it almost killed the entire ocean, and directly wiped out 75% of all species. If you were there, you would witness this Earth event firsthand. The late Devonian extinction. When you turn the hands of time back about 380 million years, you will see a highly prosperous world. One so prosperous that it feels suffocating. This era is known in paleontology as the Devonian. But it actually has a louder and more domineering name. Age of Fish. At that time on Earth, the main stage of life was not on land at all, but in that vast, boundless blue ocean. If you dived into those shallow seas, you might think you had arrived at some alien aquarium. Giant coral reefs stretching for thousands of miles nurtured countless marine creatures. What you are seeing now are the first marine overlords in evolutionary history. They are called ostracoderms. The heads and chests of these fish were covered with thick, high-strength bony plates. Among them, the most famous tyrant was called Dunkleosteus. This deep-sea behemoth reached 6 to 8 meters long, with an astonishing bite force. When Dunkleosteus patrolled above the coral reefs, the entire ocean had to make way for it. In front of them, modern sharks are just petite, low-level nobodies. It was a blue empire full of power, competition, and vitality. After millions of years of evolution, the marine ecosystem had reached an extremely delicate balance. However, while marine life was thriving, a silent power on the continents was quietly rising. Before the Devonian, Earth's land was almost a completely dead desert, with only some mosses growing close to the ground, and extremely short, early plants. They lacked root systems, and could only humbly cling to the water's edge to survive. However, by the middle to late Devonian, a genetic mutation occurred in the plant kingdom. They grew xylem and stood up straight, evolving true leaves and root systems that dug deep into the ground. On Earth, true trees appeared for the very first time, such as the famous Archaeopteris. They began to spread across the continents at an incredible speed. Trees tens of meters tall rose from the ground, blotting out the sky. Earth wore a green coat for the first time. Looking from space, Earth was a planet composed of blue and green. This seemed to be life expanding its territory. But in the Book of Life for marine creatures, this green miracle was the death warrant for their entire race. A cross-boundary murder lasting millions of years had begun. The killer was the forest, and the murder weapon was the tree roots. Before there were tall trees, the rocks on Earth's surface were extremely hard and stable. However, when these early trees, tens of meters tall, began to grow wildly, in order to support their massive bodies and search for extremely scarce water and minerals, the tree roots became the most terrifying biological drills on Earth. Countless thick tree roots dug fiercely into the ground along the cracks in the rocks. They not only cracked the rocks open, but even more fatal, their plant roots secreted a large amount of organic acid, corroding rock structures day and night without stopping. The once indestructible surface rock layers began to disintegrate, crumble heavily. This process of rock disintegration is scientifically called weathering. After the rocks were weathered, they turned into soil and gravel. More importantly, the massive amount of minerals originally locked tightly inside the rocks, especially phosphorus and iron, were completely released. If it did not rain on Earth at this time, everything might still be saved. But during that period, due to large-scale forest coverage, the intense transpiration of plants sent massive water vapor into the sky, directly changing global climates. Rainstorms, unprecedented rainstorms, began to pour down onto the land. The rainwater gathered into torrents, carrying with it a massive amount of soil generated by tree roots, as well as the extremely rich phosphorus and iron nutrients in soil, pouring grandly into that clear ocean. Do you think nutrients entering the ocean is a good thing? Won't the fish be able to eat their fill? Wrong. Dead wrong. In ecology, there is an extremely terrifying disaster called eutrophication. The Devonian Ocean was originally a clear body of water with relatively scarce nutrients but an extremely healthy cycle. But now, the forests on the continent act like a tireless superchemical fertilizer factory, dumping tens of millions of tons of ultimate tonic soup into the sea every day. This drove the ocean surface ecology completely out of control, because microscopic algae absorbed these nutrients first, not the fish on the ocean surface. Fed by infinite phosphorus and iron, the algae began to multiply crazily at an exponential rate. Within a few months, the originally azure ocean surface was covered by a thick, sticky layer, foul-smelling green algae. This layer of green ghost, like a seamless blackout cloth, tightly blocked out the sunlight. With sunlight blocked from seabed, those photosynthetic organisms at the seabed that supported the entire coral reef ecosystem began dying off on a large scale. The real despair officially began. The lifespan of algae is very short. When this wave of wildly booming algae died, millions of tons of corpses fell like green snowflakes, slowly sank to the ocean floor. At this time, the bacteria of the deep sea welcomed their feast. In the process of frantically decomposing these algal corpses, the bacteria consumed one thing: oxygen. As the algal corpses fell continuously, seabed bacteria populations spun out of control. They acted like water pumps running at full capacity, crazily draining every single bit of dissolved oxygen from the seawater. The oxygen in the seawater was exhausted bit by bit. Many sea areas gradually turned into severely hypoxic zones. The originally clear, azure, and vibrant underwater world turned into a pitch-black, oxygen-depleted, and foul ditch filled with toxic hydrogen sulfide gas. A silent, chronic suffocation completely enveloped this blue empire. The deep-sea giant beasts were the first to feel the approach of death. The larger the body size, the more oxygen intense exercise consumes. But now, the seawater is not only deoxygenated, thick, but also toxic. At this moment, you see Dunkleosteus, the apex predator of the deep sea, gulping down seawater frantically, trying to extract a bit of oxygen. But it is useless. Aside from the pungent toxic gas and the remains of algae, nothing in water. Thus, a vicious chain reaction emerged. Their carcasses sank to the seabed, further accelerating the breeding of bacteria, making the oxygen-depleted seawater even more lethal. Not only giant fish, but those giant coral reefs also met with total destruction. Corals are very delicate creatures. They need sunlight, and they need clean water currents. The massive amount of silt washed down from the forests directly buried them. Algae blocked out the sunlight, leaving them unable to breathe. Oxygen-depleted, acidic seawater is dissolving their skeletons bit by bit. The once private underwater metropolis, which stretched for thousands of kilometers, has turned into a pale ruin. Please remember, this murder was not explosive. It was an erasure that lasted for millions of years. The late Devonian extinction was not a single point in time, but a series of extremely torturous waves of strikes. In paleontology, it is mainly divided into several famous extinction events, such as the Kellwasser event and the Hangenberg event. It is as if the Earth's brain was conducting repeated trials. The seawater lost oxygen, causing massive die-offs. Then the environment recovered slightly, just as survivors tried to catch their breath and wanted to reproduce again. The forests on land began a new round of expansion. Another wave of violent mudslides rushed into the sea, triggering worse algal blooms and total oxygen depletion again. Just like that, wave after wave, torture after torture, bouncing repeatedly between hope and despair. Marine life was exhausted by torment. The complex food chain was forcefully torn apart, link by link. When this prolonged environmental upheaval finally neared its end, the final tally of the aftermath was spine-chilling. Approximately 75% of the species on Earth were completely wiped out in this green crisis triggered by forests. All the once mighty placoderms, those heavily armored tyrants of the deep sea, were completely wiped out, with not a single survivor. Reef-building organisms suffered a devastating blow. For tens of millions of years thereafter, no proper coral reef system ever appeared on Earth again. That once vibrant age of fishes met its miserable end in a suffocating toxic soup. However, the game of life on Earth did not end. Disaster is always the grave of old rulers and breeding grounds for new forces. When 75% of the species collapsed and the marine ecology was completely reshuffled, those once oppressed and marginalized vulnerable groups welcomed a sudden stroke of overwhelming fortune. The first to take over the aftermath were the sharks. In the early Devonian, early sharks were small in size and lacked heavy armor, so they could only tremble in the shadow of Dunkleosteus. Yet because of their small size, their demand for oxygen was low, giving them stronger survival resilience in muddy, anoxic environments. Once Dunkleosteus was suffocated to death, sharks quickly filled the vacant ecological niche of top predators, ushering in a long reign of their own. However, those who completely changed Earth's life trajectory were another group of survivors driven into a corner. At the boundary of shallow seas and rivers, there lived a group of creatures called Sarcopterygii. Due to severe oxygen depletion, they simply could not stay submerged anymore, experiencing the agony of suffocation every single second. To survive, they were forced to poke their heads out of the water and gulp down mouthfuls of air. After a long period of evolution, their swim bladders gradually turned into primitive lungs, and their strong, fleshy fins gradually evolved into limbs capable of supporting their bodies. Because water was a toxic soup, and because it became a living hell, they had to crawl desperately toward land. At this moment, the most dramatic scene unfolded. The very forests that turned the oceans into an anoxic hell, instead, they became the perfect sanctuary for these land conquerors. Although the dense forests killed the oceans, they produced an extremely abundant supply of oxygen on land and nurtured a massive number of insects. When early tetrapods crawled ashore with all their might, dragged their wet bodies into the forest, they found that there were no giant predators here. The air here was sweet, and food was everywhere. Thus, they said goodbye to the ocean for good, and walked deep into the continent. If not for this tragic late Devonian mass extinction in the ocean, the ancestors of these vertebrates might never have crawled onto land. Then, land animals would lack diversity, and there would be no us watching this video today. We are all descendants of the survivors of this ancient great escape. But this was merely another trial. If this mass extinction was a gentle rope, then next time what living things would have to face would be the most violent rage of the earth. It used an extremely brutal way to tell all life. The earth was never gentle. It is a cold and ruthless experimenter. It will constantly reboot, constantly change the rules, and constantly filter life. The next ultimate nightmare that would turn the entire earth almost into a dead planet is in the deeper darkness, quietly brewing. I am Lauma, see you in the next era.